Welcome to How to Speak Solar. My name's Melissa Birch. I'm with the Clean Energy Resource Teams. I'm based at the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm delighted to speak to you today about solar. Today we'll talk about some important solar terms and concepts. We'll add a little bit about storage or batteries. I'll talk a little bit about simple steps to solar. So how do you get from point A to point B on a solar project? And then we'll dive into a case study of a residential solar project. So let's get started. The foundation for solar installations, solar projects, are solar cells, also called PV cells. These are the building blocks of solar modules. So they are what convert sunlight into electricity. Solar modules or panels are where solar cells have been wired together and set within a frame. So most people call them panels, but they are officially called solar modules. When you take all the modules or panels and connect them together into a PV system, you have a solar array. So different types of panels exist, and they have differing efficiencies. And I'll talk about a few of these, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about efficiency of solar panels, because that's confusing for a lot of folks. So when we're talking about the efficiency of a solar panel or a solar project, what we're actually talking about is the percentage of energy from sunlight hitting the panel that is converted to electricity. So if we say that a panel has efficiency of 20%, what that means is that 20% of the energy from the sunlight hitting the panel is converted into electricity. So with that in mind, the least efficient panels are the thin film or amorphous panels. And those are flexible panels. Some people do use them because they can be added to curved surfaces, for instance, or they can be integrated easily into architectural materials. So they do have a purpose, but they are the least efficient of the types of panels. Most panels that you're going to see are actually monocrystalline panels, and those are made up of thin slices of individual crystals. And so each cell is one slice of a crystal. You might also sometimes see half-cut panels, which are half-cut solar cells. Or you may also sometimes see bifacial, and bifacial is typically going to be your most efficient panel because it can absorb the sunlight that comes from above, but it also has a surface on the bottom that will absorb the reflected sunlight. For instance, if you have snow under a ground-mounted solar array, it will collect the energy reflected up from the snow. So the next piece of a PV system is the inverter. And the inverter is there because of the need to convert direct current, or DC, to alternating current, or AC. So solar cells produce electricity in the form of direct current. Electrons are flowing in one direction all the time. Our electrical system, on the other hand, uses alternating current, or AC, so the flow of electrons reverses directions many times per second. So that means that a PV system has solar modules, which produce the DC electricity, but also one or more inverters to change the DC electricity into AC electricity that we can use. There are a couple of different types of inverters that we see. String inverters and microinverters. String inverters is slightly less expensive. You typically would have one string inverter for a bunch of solar panels. So if you had a string inverter on a roof-mounted system, you would typically have one string inverter and then a bunch of panels connected to it. A microinverter, in contrast, attaches to each solar panel. So you would, if you had 20 panels on your roof, you would have 20 microinverters, one attached to each panel. The advantage of microinverters is that they do well in cases where there's some shading, or if there are panels at different angles or slightly different directions, because your roof is not a sort of a really simple roof. A microinverter can be a really good fit for that. They are a little bit expensive, a little bit more expensive than string inverters, but we are seeing a lot of them, especially on roof-mounted systems. The next concept I want to introduce is kilowatts and kilowatt hours and the difference between them, because it's really important when you're talking about solar systems. So kilowatts, or kW, measures the rate of energy consumption or production. So if you think about it in terms of a water analogy, it would be how much water is flowing through a hose. So the rate at which energy is consumed or produced. Kilowatt hours, in contrast, measures the quantity of energy consumed or produced. So if you look at it in terms of the water analogy, it would be how much water is in the pool after an hour. A couple of examples. If you use a 1 kW microwave for 2 hours, it's going to consume 2 kilowatt hours. If you have a 10 kW solar array and it operates for 2 hours, it's going to produce 20 kilowatt hours. Now, think back to 8th grade math, 7th grade math, somewhere in there. Remember that the prefix kilo means 1,000. So 1 kilowatt is equal to 1,000 watts. 1,000 kilowatts is equal to 1 megawatt. So that'll be important when we talk about system size. So the reason we went into this is that the size of a PV system is usually measured in kilowatts. In other words, the system size is measured by the rate at which it can produce electricity. So a pretty typical home system is on that home right there. And that is a 9 kW system. So 9 kW, remember that's 9,000 watts or 0.009 megawatts. A pretty typical size for a commercial or agricultural system would be a 40 kW system. And that's going to be the size of a tennis court. And we're going to come back to that 40 kW after a little bit when we talk about net metering and compensation for the excess generation from your system. But it's important to note that 40 kW, really common size, and it's the size of a tennis court approximately. Continuing up to much larger installations, think about community or utility scale solar. That's when we start talking about megawatts. So 1 megawatt of solar uses 7 to 10 acres of land, depending on spacing and things like that. In Minnesota, community solar gardens can be up to 5 megawatts. And in Minnesota, another important number, if you're thinking at the community or utility scale, is 50 megawatts. And that's because decision-making authority about permitting of those energy facilities has a dividing line at 50 megawatts. Smaller than 50 megawatts the jurisdiction rests with the local government, usually the county. Larger than 50 megawatts, the jurisdiction rests with the State Public Utilities Commission. So in Minnesota, 50 megawatt, larger than 50 megawatt rests with the Public Utility Commission. They decide on the permitting of that facility. All right, zooming back down, I want to talk a little bit about different configurations of PV systems. So the first one I'm going to talk about is grid connected, and that is the most common and least expensive of the system types. It is basically you have your panels, you have your inverter, and you connect to the grid. So you interconnect with the grid. And in a way, basically what happens is when you produce more electricity than you are consuming in your home, that excess generation is fed back onto the grid for someone else to use. When you are consuming more electricity than your system is producing, so like at night, then you are drawing electricity from the grid and consuming that. So that's your grid connected system. It's really important to remember that when you have a grid connected system and no batteries, when the grid goes down, like when you have a power outage, your solar will also shut down. And that's really important because there's a safety issue concerned there. If the grid goes down, typically there's going to be someone out working on those lines. Electrical workers from the utility are going to be out working on those lines. And if your solar array is feeding electricity back onto the grid, energizing those lines, that can be a real big safety concern for the people working on the lines. So if you just have a grid connected system, when you have an outage, your solar will also be turned off. If you want to have backup during those times, then what you need to have is grid connected with battery backup. And that's going to have your interconnection with the grid, but also a battery bank that you charge with your solar array. And then when there's an outage, your system will cut its connection with the grid. It'll shut that off so that it's not feeding anything back onto the lines, and just connect with your battery bank and your home. So that's your grid connected with battery backup. The last one is the standalone system. And a standalone system is exactly what it sounds like. It is not connected with the grid. That's your off-grid system. And that's where you have your solar array, your inverters, charge controller, some other equipment, but basically it's your solar plus battery. All right, back to net metering and that tennis court. So this is all about getting compensated for that excess generation that you put back onto the grid when your solar is producing more than you are consuming. So in Minnesota, the size of your system as measured in kilowatts affects the rate at which you are compensated for excess generation. So under 40 kW, you get paid for extra electricity that you generate at the utility's retail rate. If your system is larger than 40 kW DC, you get paid at an avoided cost rate, which is typically much, much lower. There are some slight differences in net metering rules for investor-owned utilities like Minnesota Power, Xcel, and Otter Tail Power, as opposed to rural cooperative and municipal utilities. But in both cases, 40 kW is an important number to know. The other thing to remember is that it's really important to communicate early and often with your electric utility if you're thinking about solar, so that you can be sure you understand their policies around things like incentives or grid access fees or a variety of other things. But key point, communicate early and often if you're thinking about solar. Right, let's take a look at storage, or as most people call it, batteries. Why would you add storage? Well, you might want to run your home or critical devices during power outages. You might also want to increase how much of your solar generation is used on site in your home or business rather than being sold back to the grid. And you might also have a remote or mobile need for electricity, so like a cabin in the woods or a boat or an RV. So those are all good reasons to add storage. If you're thinking of adding storage, you want to start by asking your solar installer. Even if you aren't planning to include storage right away, if you know that you might want to down the road, they can design the system to make that easy. You also want to decide on your priorities, like which devices do you want your battery to run and for how long. So the more you try to power and the longer you try to power it, obviously, the more batteries you'll need, the larger the battery system that you'll need. And that's going to increase the size of your battery system. Which brings me to determining your budget. Be aware that a typical home battery system will cost $15,000 to $25,000. So that's in addition to the cost of the solar. Okay, let's look at how you get from idea to implementation on a solar project. The first thing that we always say is do efficiency first. Remember that the cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. So you want to make your home as efficient as possible before you add solar. Once you've done that, then you want to ask some questions. And the first one is, how sunny is your site? If you have a really shady roof or a really shady property, it might not be a good fit for you to install solar. You also want to ask if your roof is relatively new. So if you're thinking of putting solar on a roof, remember that solar panels last for 25, 30, or more years. So if you put it on a roof that's going to need to be replaced in the next 25 years or so, you will have to uninstall that solar, do the re-roofing job, and then reinstall the solar. And that's very expensive. So it's really important to say, okay, is my roof within 20 years of needing to be replaced? If so, then it might make sense to first re-roof. And then once you've done that, then do your solar. And finally, are there local government rules that might affect your project? So check with your local planning and zoning department to make sure that you understand any permitting or other rules related to your project. Then you're going to determine your budget and think about, are you planning to pay cash or are you considering a loan? Do you pay enough income taxes to access a solar tax credit? So think through those items and then get some bids. You want to compare bids from multiple installers, preferably at least 3. If you go to our website, you can find a directory of solar installers in Minnesota, and you can also find a list of questions that you should ask installers when you're considering going with them. You can also, at this point, look at how much you might expect a system to generate on your site. So you can go to pvwatts.nrel.gov. So that's a tool offered by the National Renewable Energy Lab. And you can put in all sorts of different parameters and get a sense for how much would a system generate in my location. And you also want to take a look at those bids that you get and compare the costs. And the easiest way to do that is cost per watt. So that can help you get an apples to apples comparison of different bids. So for instance, if you got two bids, one for a 9 kW system costing $30,000, a second one for a 6 kW system costing $25,000, you would get your cost per watt by dividing 30,000, your cost, by 9,000. So 9,000 watts is the same as 9 kW. And that would give you a cost per watt of $3.33. In the case of the 6 kW system, costing $25,000, you would divide 25,000 by 6,000, and you would get a cost per watt of $4.17. And that by doing that, you can get that apples to apples comparison and see that the second bid, even though it's a lower overall cost, is a higher cost for the amount of electricity that it will generate. Once you've selected your company, you'll sign a contract and install your system. So your contractor should facilitate an interconnection agreement with your electric utility. And once the system is installed, your utility will come out, do a test to make sure that it does in fact shut down if the grid has an outage, so that their workers will be safe. And once that happens, then your system can be energized. And at that point, it's a great time to share your story. So you could be the inspiration for others who are interested in installing solar and want some lessons learned and know what to expect. All right, I'm going to wrap up here with one little case study, and it's a residential solar project. You've seen this house earlier in the presentation. It is a little over 1,000 square feet. It's an all-electric home. It doesn't have any natural gas or propane. Efficiency measures are in place. It's got LED lights. It's got air source heat pumps and good insulation, in-floor heat with an electric boiler. The average usage is 800 kilowatt hours per month, or 9,600 kilowatt hours per year. And it's located in central Minnesota with an electric rate of 11.5 cents per kilowatt hour, meaning that the cost before solar of electricity per year was about $1,100. Okay, so let's look at the system. We look at the house and we see that the roof orientation is southwest. So not directly south like we would like, but still pretty southish. It also has a little bit of shading, which is not ideal, especially in the winter, but it's not a lot of shading. There are just some trees a good distance away that shade the bottom during the winter months. So the system that was installed was a 9 kW DC system, or 7.5 kW AC, because you lose a little when it goes through the inverter. It has microinverters, and the annual production from the array is 9,100 kilowatt hours per year. Looking at the financials, the upfront cost was $30,000. The tax credit took $9,000 off that, and so the cost after the credit was $21,000. The value of the 2023 energy production, which was its first year, was about $1,000, a little bit over. Remember that utility prices rise over time. So a 2% annual increase is a good conservative estimate for that utility escalation rate. And so with an expected lifespan of 25 to 30 years, this system will pay back. And with that, I would like to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining me. Remember that you can always reach out to us at ambassadors@cleanenergyresourceteams.org.